Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the mandibular second premolar. The mandibular second premolar looks like the first premolar and erupts around 11 to 12 years of age. When we look at the mandibular second premolar, from the buccal aspect, you can see that it has a single buccal cusp. And from this aspect, it looks similar to that of the first premolar, like you see here, the buccal aspect. But the lingual aspect looks totally different. When I shift it to the lingual side, you will find that there are two cusps, whereas the mandibular first premolar has a single cusp. But there is a variant of second premolar which has only a single buccal cusp. Another feature that is very prominent is from the proximal surface, where you can see that the lingual cusp is much more well developed than the first premolar. So let's have a look at the mandibular second premolar. The mandibular second premolar has two forms. The first form is a three cusp type, which is most common. So you have two lingual cusps. The mesial cusp is larger than the distal cusp. So we call it the mesiolingual cusp, which is larger than the distal lingual cusp. And there's a two cusp type where you have one buccal and one lingual cusp, and it has a very nice, well developed lingual cusp. So let's have a look at the mandibular second premolar in comparison with that of the mandibular first premolar from the buccal aspect. From the buccal aspect, you can appreciate that the cusp height is shorter. Now this is a comparative finding. The cusps show lesser angulation. That is because this particular slope, the mesial and the distal slope, are much more obtuse in the second premolar than in the first premolar. The contact points are much higher placed compared to that of the first premolar. Although it is at the junction of the middle and the occlusal third, it can go into the occlusal third also. So a slightly higher placed contact point on both the sides. The root also is a little wider compared to that of the first premolar. So all these are comparative differences. When you change over to the lingual aspect, that is when this becomes a little more prominent. You see two well-developed lobes. Unlike the first premolar, which is developed by four lobes, the second premolar has a central buccal lobe and two lobes on either side of that. So the buccal surface is made by 1, 2, and 3 lobes, and the lingual surface is actually made by 2 lobes. So you can see the more prominent mesiolingual developmental lobe and the less prominent distolingual developmental lobe. So these form the two cusps. Although the lingual surface is well developed, you can still see some portion of the buccal cusps. You can see the buccal triangle ridge in this particular region. The three cusp types show a very characteristic larger mesiolingual cusp and a shorter distolingual cusp. And there is a groove in between, like here you can see the groove which kind of extends into the lingual surface. This gives rise to a characteristic Y-shaped pattern of the groove that you can see, which is relatively centered over the root. Here are some examples of the teeth. So here you can see the characteristic appearances of the premolars. So the first row is the first premolar, and here you have the second premolar, and the last row here is the two cusp type. You can see the characteristic Y-shaped grooves in the three cusp type, and the two cusp type does not have that Y-shaped groove pattern that you see. Let's continue with the lingual aspect. The lingual aspect does show some convergence. So if you see from the occlusal side, you can see that both the sides have a convergence towards the lingual surface. Although it's not so prominent as that of the first premolar, you can see some portion of the mesial and the distal surfaces from the lingual aspect. The lingual surface is smooth and spheroidal, and the root is bulky, forming a small apical tip, which may go more mesially in certain cases, but usually it is on the distal side. Let's go on to the mesial aspect. when you look at the mesial aspect, you can see very less of the occlusal surface, and it is showing the characteristic width of this particular crown and the root. You will find that the buccal crest of curvature is in the middle of the cervical third, whereas the lingual crest of curvature is somewhere in the middle of the middle third. This is a characteristic feature of both the premolars, giving a lingual overhang. If you see the lingual-most portion of the crown, it is outside the lingual portion of the root, giving the characteristic lingual overhang that you see. Another difference is the buccal cusp is not centered over the root. So when you look at the buccal cusp, it is much more buccally placed compared to that of the first premolar. You can see that the marginal ridges here are at right angle to that of the long axis of the tooth. If you remember, in the first premolar, we had the buccal triangular ridge parallel to the mesial marginal ridge. Here it is not the case, and you see a perpendicularity in that particular area. And we do not see any mesiolingual groove in the second premolar, whereas that is the characteristic finding of the first premolar. And the root apex is usually blunt, and when you turn around to the distal aspect, you will find that you can see more of the occlusal surface from this area. Obviously, because the distal lingual cusp is shorter and you have the distal marginal ridge, which is much more cervically placed compared to the mesial marginal. This is a characteristic feature of both the maxillary and the mandibular posterior teeth. The occlusal surface is usually tipped distally according to the curve of Spee that forms in these teeth. Let's move around to the occlusal aspect. From the occlusal aspect, you can see that the three-cusp type has a typical squarish appearance, as you see here. And this square outline has the very typical order, the buccal cusp being the largest, followed by the mesiolingual cusp, followed by the distolingual cusp, and it has this characteristic Y-shaped groove which is noted. And this Y-shaped groove is a very typical feature of the three-cusp type. Whereas in a two-cusp type, like you see in this condition, you will see a very nice smiley-like curved central groove. And this Y shape is there only in the three-cusp type, which is slightly placed distally, mesiodistally, obviously because the mesiolingual cusp is bigger than the distolingual cusp. So let's have a look at this groove pattern. So when you look at this groove pattern, the mesial groove ends in the mesial triangular fossa. The distal groove is shorter, again ends in the distal triangular fossa. So if you have to describe this, you have a central pit which is formed, and this central pit is slightly more distally placed, and from the central groove, a small distal groove goes distally, distobuccally, and ends in the distal pit. Same way, from the central pit, a groove goes mesiobuccally, ends in the mesial pit. And the lingual groove runs between the two lingual cusps, going down onto the lingual surface, ending in the lingual surface, maybe a millimeter into the lingual surface. And the occlusal aspect shows very prominent buccal ridge. So you can see the buccal ridge here. You can see the lingual ridge, two lingual ridges. The mesiolingual ridge is bigger than the distolingual ridge, as you see in the diagram. So you will have this characteristic H-shaped groove pattern in a two-cusp type and a Y-shaped groove pattern in a three-cusp type of the mandibular second premolar. The two-cusp type has a typical rounded appearance. It has an oval outline, has a more prominent lingual convergence, and this is mainly because the mesiolingual lobe is much more well developed than the distolingual lobe. From the occlusal aspect, the central groove, like I said, will be a crescent shape, a smiley shape. It terminates from one lingual fossa to the other lingual fossa, the mesiolingual fossa to the distal lingual fossa. Here are some examples. You can see the smiley shape here and the head-shaped here. Maybe typically tries to form a V shape over here. but in a three-cusp type, you will have the typical Y-shaped pattern. So this finishes with the mandibular second premolar. Thank you.